We'll get to Lonnie, I'll let you respond too, and you can in this answer, but I think let's move on to this specific question about the budget, and let's be as specific as we can moving forward. Obviously, you both have a lot of ideas of what you want to do, but you also have this tight budget to work with. So I'll start with you, Lonnie. Like, what would you emphasize? What are you going to cut? Like, what are your thoughts on the budget?
Well, I think one of the things that I'm really supporting is Measure K. Measure K will help us bring about $10 million a year. It will not tax things like groceries.
And it won't cut for everything. We're still going to have to cut. So some things are still going to have to face cuts. So it will cover some if it passes.
I mean, my hope is that we are actually going to bring in more funding into the community. You're making an assumption that we have to make cuts on things that we currently have, right? So that means really getting into the weeds and looking at what needs to be cut. And I would say that takes more time and sitting with our leadership and with our county staff to say, okay, these are some things that need to be cut.
Have you looked at the budget and thought about like what you might not want to have?
I've looked at the budget, but I'm really thinking more, honestly, I've spent more time thinking about how we can bring more funding in and how I can collaborate and work with our state legislators to bring more money in. Because what are you going to cut? Are you going to cut schools? You're going to cut mental health? Right. Are you going to cut affordable housing? And we already need more money to look at housing first programs. We already need more money to look at our roads, right? So we need to look at how we can bring more funding in, how we can be prioritized. And also we can look at things when you talk about roads, let's talk about states. The state of California and the Caltrans, we should be asking them to pay for costs on Highway 1. We shouldn't be coming out of our pocket for our local streets, right? So we need to be looking at things like Measure K that will allow us to take more money and allot it towards our roads. We need to look at things like Measure K that will allow us to help with our mental health issues. How are you going to cut so many vital services? I say we need to start raising more money. We need to start working hand in hand with our legislators. And I'm a state delegate for the Democratic Party, so that's something that I really want to work hard on.
Do you want to rephrase the question a little bit? So
well, just looking at the budget. You're looking at the budget,
okay.
Right? And so you have a lot of ideas. You know from experience that you can't get everything through.
Yeah.
What are you going to push? What are you going to cut? What are you not? What
right,
you know? How are you going to work on this?
So I think that is precisely the problem. What are you going to cut? Because when you only have $200 million in discretionary funding, and you've got to fund public safety, the sheriff's office, public defender, district attorney, we have to fund the departments just enough to be operational in order to pull down matching state funds. So the majority of the health services agency, for example, is actually money coming through the county that we then distribute in the form of social programs. But we have to fund it a little bit to make sure that there's actually staff there to help distribute that money and operate those programs. So there's just not a lot of room to cut. You're right. I don't think that asking extra nice is going to get more money out of the state, especially not in a budget deficit year where, $30 to $60 billion deficit. So here's what I'm going to do. First of all, we look at what we can do in this county, and it goes back to our planning department, because the excessive process that we have issuing new permits for housing. And let me give you an example. I talked to one guy, he was just trying to get a demolition permit for his home so that then he could come in and put in a manufactured home in its place. And it took him a year just to get the demolition permit. This is insane. And it amounts to the biggest tax on our community that exists. And it's the one thing that is fully within our discretion as a county to change. So, like I said, we've been nibbling around the edges of this problem. We got whole new leadership in the planning department since I took office, made a number of significant changes, but I think we need to completely start from scratch and change the way we think about permitting in this community. And the second thing is, I don't think the state is willingly going to give us more money, but we do need to talk about property taxes, because we only get 13% of our property taxes to the county here, and we don't have enough discretionary money. So I'm working to build a statewide coalition to address this property tax issue, because it's got to change.
Lonnie, or
yeah, I'd love to respond to that.
Oh, you want to respond?
If you
Okay,
don't mind.
Of course, sorry.
Yeah, I've been talking to a lot of people, and I think there's a real point of misinformation here, and that is that we actually get 100% of our property taxes back to the county. So just to let you know, about 50% of those funds go towards schools, about 0.5% goes towards fire, about 4% goes to the cities distributed between 4 cities. Then you have your water districts, your sewer districts, and all of these other specific functions that go on. 13.5% goes into specific roads and functions and parks in the unincorporated part of the county. But 100% of our property taxes actually come back to us. So the problem really is that we need more money. But it's not going to come from more property taxes unless we charge more property taxes. So I'd ask you the question, where do you want that money to come from to go to the unincorporated? Should we take it from the schools? Shall we take it from our fire departments?
I can respond to that. The county gets 13.5%. The average statewide is about 20% for counties. So it would be nice to have at least the average. It's true, 57% of our property taxes goes to schools. It all stays local, right? But what happens in those other counties where they get 20% and surely the other entities get a little bit less? Well, the answer is the state steps in to make sure the schools stay whole, or at least get the minimum amount of funding. It's called the LCFF funding formula. And because our property taxes are so conveniently covering those costs, the state basically doesn't fund those schools. And so if you look at the state funding in our county, the difference is extreme based on how old the school is, basically, what right they have to the property taxes. And so you have some schools that are getting $650 per student, and others that are getting $7,000 per student. The way the state funds schools is completely messed up, and yes, reforming that is a big piece of this as well.
I think all of us can agree that Proposition 13 was a not good thing for many reasons. It really destroyed the schools in California. One of the biggest problems with Prop 13 is that the benefit for what people do as they get older and become on a fixed income also translates to commercial, right? So we know that we need to protect our seniors and people on a fixed income, but those commercial benefits have a lot of power in Proposition 13. It would really take a state proposition and, as the incumbent said, a major coalition across the state to make these changes. But my concern is that the incumbent is unable to make some similar and important, actually more important changes here locally, really addressing the issues that we need to look at locally. Thank you, sorry.
Okay, I think I'll let you address this as we move on, but otherwise we're never going to get through the questions. We'll start with you, Manu. A lot of people in District 1 are worried about the high cost of rent. So let's talk about rent. Should the county play a role in helping with the stabilization of rent or rental assistance?
So first of all, I don't think that Prop 13 was a terrible idea. There were certainly some issues with it, but it allows a lot of people to stay in their homes. So as far as rental assistance goes, I don't think that we have the budget to directly step in and pay people's rent, but I do think that the county should create a fund that we can provide emergency rental assistance to keep people in their homes if necessary. If it's the difference between someone being out on the street and being able to make this month's rent and make things work, absolutely we should step in with some kind of assistance. I've been talking with our Housing for Health director about doing just that. I mean, we might look at cutting some funds or allocating some of the funds from our core program. That's basically the $5 million in our budget that we allocate to nonprofits in our community. And I've asked specifically that we look at how we help with housing and homelessness initiatives. I think we could get some money for rental assistance there. And then I think there's other things we can do as far as just working with our state partners, eliminating some of the fees to apply for a new rental unit, because we've seen extortion happening there, people being charged $200 per application. That's ridiculous. We should be on a common app. I think there are a number of things that we can do to help. And of course, fundamentally, just building more housing in the community, particularly along transit corridors. And that's a lot of what we've set the table for with the housing element and the sustainability update to our general plan.
Rent stabilization?
Absolutely. I think what we have going on right now is a serious national crisis. And I call it the gaping wound that we're bleeding out nationally, where with our wealth gap, we have, and I'm gonna state a quote. There's no state in the United States where one person earning the federal minimum wage can afford a 2-bedroom apartment at fair market rate. So the bottom line way, the quickest way that we can help keep people in their housing and out of homelessness is by creating a fund, which was mentioned earlier. We can do that in part through Measure K, so that when people lose their job or have sickness or at risk of falling into homelessness, that we have a fund to help bridge the gap. And also organizations like COPA, which is an organization of organizations, will work alongside with us to help make that possible, and that's really critical. Measure K is really critical for that. Also, we need to look at vouchers, Section 8 vouchers, but the rent stabilization part is really critical, and it's something that I've done in terms of Capitola. I helped write letters to help stabilize rent in one of the mobile home parks that they had received a notice that their rent was going to go up $500 a month, which for people on fixed income is just outrageous. So for every $100 increase in rent, you see about 8% increase in homelessness. So this is a serious issue, and we're just pushing people further and further into homelessness. And so yes, I absolutely support rent stabilization.
I actually have an audience question. What are your 3 specific actions to address people who are homeless? I think, Lonnie, you're first.
Sure, yeah. I mean, that first line of defense, talking to Heather Rogers as a public defender, she was really adamant to say that that's that first line of defense, that we need to be there with a fund to help people to keep them out of homelessness. Once a person is in homelessness, they're homeless, it costs so much more money to then bring them out of homelessness. And what ends up happening is people that fall into homelessness, they oftentimes are maybe healthy when they're housed, but then once they're homeless, they can undergo medical issues, mental health issues. They might get on substance abuse. And so it becomes a spiraling situation that ends up costing them and us as taxpayers so much more money. So let's nip that in the bud. Let's look at our, again, rent stabilization, Section 8 vouchers. Let's get more people into the available with Section 8 vouchers and into homes. That's something that I really support. Helping homeowners feel safe. How can we help homeowners feel safe? Because there's a stigma around people with Section 8 vouchers. I've actually rented to Section 8 tenants myself as a landlord in the past. I've been both a renter and a landlord. And I would say that Section 8 tenants are wonderful, and we can really, really support an important way to get people housed with that. There's models that work in other cities, and Housing First is a very important one. Now, we really don't have a strong Housing First model here in this county, with the exception of HUD-VASH. And HUD-VASH, we know here, works well. Once people get in housing, get wraparound services for that year, about 85% stay housed. So it's a very great program, and it's one that we really need to put a lot of effort and money into. Thank you.
Top 3, I agree preventing homelessness is the best thing, as we already talked about, creating a fund to keep people, be able to pay rent and keep people off the streets in the first place is definitely a priority. But as far as folks who are already experiencing homelessness, my top 3 are more safe parking programs. Because actually the most cost-effective program that the county funds today is with the Association of Faith Communities, their safe parking program, and they have an incredibly successful exit rate from that program. I believe it's close to 50% of all people who go through the program become permanently housed, and we need to expand it. I think that, again, looking at core funds for this year would be a great source for that. The second is, yes, housing first, but we've set the bar so far up there for what housing is, right? I mean, it costs at least $500,000 to build a new apartment these days. And so we need to look at creating temporary housing solutions, transitional housing solutions. I mean, a tiny home without a bathroom is not going to be eligible for a Section 8 voucher. That's a problem. I think frankly, it's nowhere really in our zoning code or permitting code today. So I would actually create that element of defining where we can put these kinds of transitional structures. And then in other communities like Austin, with their Community First Village, we've seen that, or Seattle, which has an ordinance similar to this, we've seen that the community has actually privately funded a lot of those transitional housing units themselves. So I think we can work on that as a way to raise some funds and build some of this transitional housing. And then finally, for the folks who are truly addicted, truly suffering from mental illness, we are going to have to build more substance use disorder programs, and yes, even more locked mental health care facilities. And I think if Proposition 1 passes, that'll be one source of funds, and we can work collaboratively with neighboring counties to get that done as quickly as possible.
Okay, this is another audience question. I think, Manu, it's yours first. Describe a life experience where you developed a compromise solution that creatively addressed the concerns of two or more opposing groups. I guess a question about compromise, right? So where you creatively came up with a solution that you brought together two or more opposing groups.
You mean like every single policy issue I've worked on? Because that's the reality, right? Is as soon as you work with one group, you bring it forward, you think this is the greatest idea in the world. As soon as more people hear about it, you start hearing from the people who think it's a terrible idea and absolutely should not happen. I mean, the first thing that jumps to mind is the enhanced tenant protections ordinance that I brought forward. I worked with COPA, communities organized for relational power and action, who said the people we work with are suffering from, this was actually right around as the COVID eviction protections were expiring. They said we need enhanced protections, particularly for people who don't speak English, who are being threatened with eviction wrongly. And I said, great, let's improve our ordinance, and particularly with strengthened protections for folks where English is a second language. I introduced it. And then, heard from the real estate community who said, hey, you've got something in there that's going to basically make it impossible for us to, basically cause-based evictions, like requiring that even for single-family, I think it was for multifamily units is really hard because, for example, I've got a tenant, this was coming from someone in the real estate community who's a landlord. I've got a tenant who I can't prove that he's dealing drugs, but let's just say there are white Mercedes showing up at the property at 2 a.m. and I hear lots of complaints from his neighbors. So I don't have the cause to actually evict this person, but it would, and if that's a requirement, then I'm not going to be able to help all the neighbors here in these kinds of situations. So ultimately we took out the requirement for just cause evictions in multifamily properties and got the ordinance passed so that we could still help non-English speakers.
And
Two or
yours,
more
Lonnie?
opposing groups.
2 or more opposing groups.
I am racking
Very
my brain
specific.
trying to think of an example. I'm really terrible at these pop kind of quizzes. But having worked in the medical world, you're always looking at solutions and working across with different groups and differing opinions. And even though I can't speak of a specific example in the moment, I think it's really critical. And to me, one thing that is core to my personality is being a bridge builder. And being a bridge builder means listening and getting a perspective, because a lot of times a person will come to an argument with a perspective that is really valid, right? And I can think of a very good example right now. I hesitate to mention it, but people on both sides of that issue have really valid emotional reasons that support why they feel the way they do. And so I think honoring the emotions behind where people come to the choices that they make or the decisions that they want to make, and then addressing those emotions and the reasons, and then trying to get people to see different perspectives, right? We see things from different perspectives wherever we stand, what our upbringing is. And getting a respectful dialogue between people is core to being able to be a successful leader in our community. And that's something that I really feel confident about. A lot of people have said my tagline is building bridges, connecting community. And I'm really serious about that. So actually now something bubbles up. Even on my own campaign team, there were people on my campaign team that said, so-and-so's on your campaign team, but there are this and that. And I'm like, wait a minute. We all have to come together and talk. And if we don't do that, even though we disagree, we're not going to build the best solutions together.
Thanks so much. The next question, I'm going to move on and ask I'm going to combine some audience questions, and I'm going to give you just 60 seconds because we're running late on time, but I want to get some more audience answers in. It's about housing, specifically this is just kind of there's several of them. What changes would you make to the current housing policies? Sort of where in District 1 would you see a space for increasing housing density? Was that me first? Yes.
Okay. I think what we're really missing is multifamily and multi-generational housing. And where I see housing definitely is we need to look at moving it more towards those transportation corridors. And that's really critical because if we think more system-wide or systems-oriented, and I'm a systems thinker, is that if we're going to get more people out of cars or make it possible for people to have access to alternatives and use those alternatives, we're going to have more 15-minute walkable communities that they can get out of their house, walk 5 or 10 minutes, and get onto transportation and get to work. Right, so that's the kind of development that I see in the future. And again, multifamily and multi-generational housing as opposed to just the single-family residential type housing so that we can house more people and actually connecting communities. So have third spaces, having connected communities where people feel really that they can depend on each other and have more neighborhoods where they can meet together. Thanks.
So I agree. That's exactly what we're doing with the housing element and the sustainability update that we just passed. Glad you approved the plan. What else can we do? And as I mentioned, 41st and SoCal Drive, once being planned for a Nissan dealership, now being planned for 100% affordable housing. Why? Because it's on a transportation corridor, because I really fought for those 15-minute headways on that transportation corridor, which would basically make that project possible. I do think that there's more we can do. I don't think, we're going to talk about Measure M here. I don't think that more requirements are the answer. The reason we don't have more housing is because of all the freaking requirements we put on building it. Those are costs. If we add more costs, there'll be less housing. So what do we need to do? We need to look at incentives. I want to look at an incentive which would actually, within the urban area, remove the requirement for an environmental impact report, because it's infill, for any housing that is building public sector employee housing of 20 to 25%.
Thanks. Do you want to?